Welcome to the Braver Women Show. I'm Leanne C. Jones, your straight-talking therapist and founder of Braver Women. I teach anxious LGBTQ plus women all over the world how to stop feeling insecure and start showing up courageously with more impact and power. Every episode is packed with proven, actionable strategies, lived experiences, and of course, my no-nonsense insights, so you can stop letting your emotions run the show and finally feel in control. And if you're tired of struggling with anxiety, self-doubt, unresolved trauma that's affecting your life and your relationships, or feeling like you're not enough, you don't have to figure it out alone. You'll hear real success stories from women in the Braver Breakthrough program, women who've gone from the anxious patterns of self-doubt to coming out and made life-changing shifts following their work with me. Braver Women, it's good to be here. It's good to be back with you for another incredible episode. Now, this episode today is going to be a bumper episode. I'm asking a lot of you in one sitting, but actually this is going to be one of the most important ones that I've recorded. This episode, it's not a quick fix conversation. It's one to sit with, pause if you need to, and come back when it's right. But if not feeling enough or fearing rejection has been running the show in your life without you even realizing it, then this is going to be the episode that changes everything. Now, listen to this. This blew me away when I heard it. Tension is who you think you should be. Relaxation is who you really are. That's pretty powerful, isn't it? Now, most of the women that I work with, they've spent decades performing versions of themselves to just feel emotionally safe. But I help them to drop the masks, to detach from the ideas that lead to those behaviors that keep them hidden, and finally relax into who they really are, not who they were told to be. So I want to start off by asking you to consider today, what kind of protective masks do you wear? How much of yourself do you share with others? But more importantly, how hard are you working to just present what you believe to be the only acceptable parts of yourself to the outside world? And what thoughts do you have about yourself that's driving you to do this? Maybe you've been out and proud for years, or maybe you're newly out feeling like a sense of relief as you finally move forward with your journey, but something still feels off on the inside, like you've crossed the finish line or passed that coming out checkpoint decades ago, and in the quiet moments that you have with yourself when you're around others, or even in certain situations, you still have those whispers of self-doubt, scared of being fully you, holding back, not feeling good enough, and a tension that's deep within you that doesn't make sense, that you can't explain to yourself or anyone else. Now, if that sounds familiar, in this episode, you're going to find out what's really going on underneath the surface, why some parts of you feel steady and confident, but other parts of you can freeze or avoid when you feel too much. And I'm going to talk to you about a certain emotion that's likely running the show, a hidden emotion that I like to call the master emotion, because it's not obvious and it doesn't announce itself, but it's there. It's in the hesitation that you feel when someone really looks at you and sees you. When you're around other queer women, it's in the slight unease that you feel when you're considering what to wear, how to style your hair, or whether to hold your partner's hand in public. It leaks out into how you do or don't speak up for yourself, how you do or don't hold boundaries or avoid them, how you express your needs, use your voice, or keep the peace to avoid being too much. It's also the driver behind people-pleasing, overthinking, and the constant comparison to others. That urge that we all get from time to time to shrink just to keep yourself under the radar, just in case people really see you beyond the masks that you've learned to wear. And this master emotion is the thing that's shaping not only how you feel about yourself deep down, it's also shaping how you show up in those tiny, sharp moments when you least expect it to. And what I'm talking about here is something that I don't think is openly discussed or addressed enough for women in our community, and that's internalized, or otherwise known as toxic shame. You know, we might be in 2025, but for many queer women, those subtle spikes of self-doubt, anxiety, lack of confidence or fear, they still linger in the background, and they're not your fault, but they are what you've learned to feel. And the reason why I call shame the master emotion is because it doesn't just affect how you feel, it strikes at the core of who we believe we are. It doesn't just say you did something wrong, it tells you you are what's wrong. And that message seeps into everything, your confidence, your relationships, your decisions. But it also silently hides behind anxiety and depression. Internalized shame, it shows up in perfectionism, people-pleasing, withdrawal, and self-sabotage. And like any other emotional conditioning, shame trains you to deeply fear rejection and play small. But all of these responses that I'm talking about here, they're not fixed. They are symptoms of learning to cope with shame, to squash it down and prevent yourself from ever feeling the discomfort of it. These responses are learned and reinforced. And if it's learned, it means they can be unlearned. I'm not here at all to tell you that it's easy. I know firsthand just how difficult it can be, and it's not an overnight fix. But today I want to help you to really understand it first and really see it for what it is, so that you can hold it up to the light and become more aware of just how much is played out in your life before you can begin to address and detach from the hold that it has on you emotionally. Because here's what's important to understand, especially if you're an LGBTQ plus woman. All behavior is emotionally driven. Every choice we make, how we speak, what we say, what we keep to ourselves is shaped by what feels emotionally safe in the moment. And as queer women, all of us at various stages in our life, we've had to make those choices, right? We've had to carefully consider our choices for most of our lives, haven't we? We've learned to scan rooms, to shrink, to edit and hide parts of ourselves. We learn that being ourselves fully in certain situations could come at a cost. And the truth is, many of us still have to make those choices today. And all of that comes at a cost with our emotional landscapes. It shapes how we feel, how we behave, and how much of ourselves we allow to be seen. If unacknowledged shame is what's in your emotional bank, if it's the dormant emotion sitting underneath everything else, then every other emotion that you feel gets filtered through it. Your fear, your sadness, your joy, even your confidence, they're all restricted by the value system shame sets. And that's why it can feel so difficult to fully be at peace on the inside when you have this undercurrent lurking beneath. So it sounds like don't celebrate too much, don't express your sadness. And all of that is tightly wrapped around the fear-based narrative of what are people going to think? And in all my years of being a therapist, I've never once had a client come and tell me, hey, Leanne, I've got deep shame lurking beneath the surface here, and that's influencing how I feel about myself and my behavior. Most women don't even recognize it as shame. They call it insecurity. They call it overthinking. They call it anxiety, or being too sensitive, or not confident enough, or not good enough. But it's shame. It's a silent emotion that it doesn't make itself obvious what it is. It just pulls the strings quietly on the inside of you. It's like the puppet master ruling the roost on the inside. And until you become fully aware of its presence, you can't acknowledge its impact. It's the thing that keeps running the show and spilling into every part of the relationship that you have with yourself, how you interact with others, how you choose to let yourself show up in your life. And for many queer women, it's not just about identity. Often it's about trauma, emotional neglect, and adverse childhood experiences that taught you early on that your needs didn't matter, that love had conditions, that being yourself wasn't emotionally safe. And shame, it doesn't come out of nowhere. It gets layered first from what you lived through as a child, and then from the world that you learn to survive in. So often what this is, it isn't just internalized shame from societal messaging. It's the emotional residue of years spent adapting to pain that you might not have acknowledged within yourself yet. But hopefully, I'm hoping that at the end of this episode, you're going to have a deeper insight and have some understanding as to how anxiety and not enoughness, that's what I hear so commonly, how the anxiety and not enoughness that you're experiencing, it's more than just a thinking issue or a mindset issue. It's a deeply encoded experience from the past, which has formed a blueprint, if you like, through which you're living your life right now. And let's be clear, right? This kind of shame, it doesn't shift through logic. It doesn't shift through coming out or pride. It takes real work, nervous system work, emotional repatterning, being able to name and connect what's going on underneath the surface with you when those emotional memories are felt in your body. And that's the work that I do, because once you stop seeing yourself as the problem and start understanding that the problem is not anything to do with who you are, but what you've been conditioned to feel, then that's when you can begin to drop these protective masks. So you can stop the proving, the chasing, the overthinking, to reconnect your life to you and redirect your life from your own narrative, not the benchmarks or unrealistic expectations that you've been using as your compass to live your life so far. So I'm going to start by giving you a walkthrough on internalized shame, what it truly is, how it develops, how it really affects you on the inside, and the real reason why you struggle to recognize it. And towards the end, I'm going to give you some tips on how to start to move through it for yourself when it creeps in. So let's begin by just going into some detail here about what exactly shame is, so you can properly recognize how this often invisible emotion is shaping some of your current and unhelpful reactions based on the symptoms that you experience and can recognize. Now, the reason why I've described shame as invisible is not because it's not seen or felt, but it's never usually acknowledged as internalized shame. Very rarely do I hear the women that I work with say to me, you know what, this feeling that I have is deep internalized shame. And that's the thing that's shaping how I feel about myself and show up. Instead, I hear that I'm just not good enough. I'm a failure. I feel like there's something wrong with me. And this felt description of the experience of not enoughness or inadequacy is because shame is a very self-conscious emotion, meaning that it requires a sense of self and the awareness or fear of really being seen. And it has what psychologists call it, they call it an observer effect. You feel it when you imagine how others are perceiving you. It's the one emotion that leads directly to feelings of isolation, being the only one under the spotlight. It has roots in exposure and worthlessness, and it's deeply tied to your sense of identity, who you think you are, and whether you feel that you're acceptable as that person. And at the same time, it's also concerned with a heavy investment and a concentrated focus upon how others evaluate you, what they think, how they see you, whether they accept or reject you. Shame is responsible for the pain we feel when we experience social rejection or the threat of not being considered or included. And I want to be really clear about this. Shame isn't just an isolated internal response. It's the reason we respond to take action, to avoid rejection and stay connected, to be part of the crowd. It's the reason why being different feels risky and unsafe. And so in that sense, it's also an emotion that's deeply relational at its core. And because of the relational aspect, it's the quiet driver behind behaviors like people-pleasing that I've mentioned, perfectionism, self-censoring, or hiding, behaviors that are so familiar to my clients and women in the queer community as a bid to fit in, to gain approval and feel emotionally connected and psychologically safe. And I hear this a lot too. It's not only unexplained anxiety, but it's a deep fear of rejection, the anxiety behind not fitting in or being left alone. If I'm rejected in some way or not approved of, then that directly links to the idea of, well, that means I'm not good enough. and at some level, I'm fundamentally flawed. When in actual fact, instead, it's this damaging internalized self-concept that is the thing that's ultimately flawed and not you. And that's where the real work is, not in convincing yourself that it's not about you, but in healing the part of you that believes it always is. You see, shame conditions you with a sense of being undeserving and worthless. And in many ways, if this is the lens through which you think of yourself, then your sense of self, your inner voice, your wants, your needs, and your behavioral responses, they become muted and more driven by maintaining connection on the outside and less about authentically connecting to who you are and what you want on the inside. So in this respect, I think shame, it's a fear-based, attachment-based, adaptive survival strategy, first learned and imprinted as an implicit memory in your nervous system in childhood. And I'm going to talk to you about that in a moment so you understand what it is. Think about it, that the most crucial relationship to your survival as a child is the one with your parents or your caregivers, right? When kids look to parents and the world to mirror them, to answer, who am I? Am I okay? Am I lovable? And when they don't get it, they don't develop a sense of self that's centered around them as individuals. And in many ways, you learn to become scared of what your parents and caregivers are scared of, because shame develops when a child experiences emotional pain, emotional neglect, trauma, criticism or disapproval, or even rigid, unforgiving levels of discipline that a child doesn't have the emotional or developmental ability to question it. Kids, they depend on attachment for survival, and they lack that full context and cognition. So rather than seeing the environment as flawed or their caregiver's lack of attunement as flawed, kids don't stop loving the parent who shames them. Instead, kids stop loving themselves to maintain the relationship for their survival. And it sounds like this for kids, not I did something wrong or I made a mistake and I can learn and have another go. Instead, it becomes internalized as I am wrong and I am the mistake. It quickly becomes about who you are and not what you did. So this toxic shame, it originates interpersonally within significant relationships. And so in many respects, our most significant relationships are they are our source relationships. And what I mean when I say all of this, our families are where we first learn about ourselves. Our core identity comes from the mirroring eyes of our parents or primary caregivers. And in many respects, our destiny depends to some extent on the emotional intelligence of our caregivers. Because the sad thing about this reality, here's the thing, toxic shame, it's multi-generational. It's passed from one generation to the next, like the passing of hot potatoes. We learn to feel shame and work really hard to protect the hot potatoes of shame that are passed down to us. And if you've been taught that your worth is conditional and only based on the things that you achieve, things that you do or don't do, or how you look, then there's no way that you would have grown up knowing how to value yourself if these were your earliest types of lessons. So instead of valuing yourself, you learn out of awareness to do the only thing that you've learned so far, to view yourself through that external lens of being devalued. So here's the most important part that you need to know about. This is why it's a very unconscious, insidious emotion. Shame, it doesn't develop logically. It's not something that arises and comes up because you understood something was wrong. It starts very early in childhood, before you even have the language to make sense of your experiences. It forms in the emotional parts of your brain before the thinking or understanding parts are even online. And that's why it sticks. That's why it's hard to name or recognize as as an adult, it's remembered implicitly. That's what I mean when I say about an implicit memory. It's not through words, logic, or images. It's remembered through feeling, through the way you shrink, freeze, or disconnect when you feel too exposed, because it's not about the what happened that you can recall with clarity. You don't remember it like a story or fact. It's about the emotional residue, the imprinted feeling that lives in your nervous system. And you might not remember, none of us do we? You might not remember being ignored as a toddler, but if your nervous system learned that reaching out doesn't get a response, so now as an adult, you hesitate to ask for support. Or if you were constantly walking on eggshells around a parent's mood, you might not recall specific moments, but you've internalized a deep sense that you're only safe when you're quiet, when you're pleasing, or when you're invisible. And that's why shame shows up as a wave of anxiety before you speak your truth, or that sudden shutdown when someone gets too close, for example. You don't logically remember where it started, you just feel it, and your body believes that it's protecting you from danger, because guess what? Once upon a time it was. And this is why so many clients say to me, I don't know why I feel this way, nothing's happened. It's because the story, it's not in your words, it's in your nervous system, it's in your body. What we call this is implicit memory. Let me just give you an example of how shame imprinted in implicit memory can play out in your life so you understand it fully. Let's say you're getting ready to go out and you reach for an outfit that feels like the real you. Maybe it's more masculine, maybe it's more feminine, or more visibly queer, or it's just a little louder than usual. And you look in the mirror and something shifts on the inside. There's a tightening in your chest, a second guessing, or a sudden urge just to tone it down a bit. And no one said anything, nothing's happened, but you change. You dial it down, you get changed again, you dial it down with your hair or your outfit, and you choose to go safer. And you might say to yourself, I don't know why I always do this. But here's the thing, it's not about the clothes, it's not about the style, it's about a memory that your body holds without words, without images. And you might not recall the moment it started. And that's because it likely began before you had the language to understand it or describe it. Perhaps when you were little, someone frowned at you for being too expressive, or they looked uncomfortable when you showed too much joy or creativity. Or you simply felt the coldness or rejection when you stepped outside the box, even just slightly. And your thinking brain didn't make a story out of it, but your body remembered the feeling. And now, years later, you dress or express yourself according to that blueprint that was formed before you could speak. And it's like a quiet instruction that says it's safer not to be seen as you really are, or it's safer to not express yourself. Don't attract attention. Don't make anyone feel uncomfortable. And so that's not fashion anxiety or even social anxiety. That's shame. That's implicit memory doing its job to keep you safe, even if it costs you your authenticity. So when I say shame is like an attachment emotion, what I mean is it's learned in relationship to other people. You don't just feel it out of nowhere. You feel it because caregivers, people in authority growing up, peers, and then society in some way systematically taught us to internalize and hold on to reinforced mainstream messages with strong conviction within our nervous system that part of us is not okay. That part of us is wrong. That part of us risks love or safety. And so you can also begin to see why shame can be the fuel behind codependency or anxious attachment. When a child experiences inconsistent love, they internalize that belief of, I must not be enough as I am. And this creates that anxious attachment, that constant fear of disconnection and shame, the sense that they are the problem. So if this is the experience that you had as a child, as an adult, you might find yourself clinging to people. You might find yourself people pleasing, or you might find yourself over functioning or fearing abandonment just to stay close. All of this to protect yourself from the shame of being rejected or unworthy. So essentially, anxious attachment is the relational expression, but shame is the emotional root. And in this respect, shame also has deep roots in hiding and inauthenticity, which results in a loss of connection to yourself, because you can feel fragmented and disconnected to your real self on the inside. I'm not showing up for me, I'm showing up in a way that's palatable for them, so I don't lose the connection, like a sacrificing of authenticity over attachment, which I see all the time in my practice. Women who are full of self-doubt, because what's happening is they're bypassing themselves, their own authentic instincts, but they're bypassing their self-trust, their inner knowing and internal voice as a protective measure, which has fundamentally been learned in childhood to keep unhealthy attachments alive, which results in a pattern of ongoing seeking safety on the outside, externally. And it's one of the main reasons why there are women out there who are scared to change and are only skimming the surface with fully being themselves, because out of awareness, there's this unaddressed fear that's rooted in shame, which, if we were to give this fear words, it would sound like, I'd rather have this attachment, even if you treat me like shit, than express myself and my needs fully and lose the connection. So now, even as an adult, even if you're out, even if you're proud, there's a tug inside that says, stay small, don't make them uncomfortable, don't rock the boat. And that's the felt memory of shame speaking. That's the nervous system saying it's much safer to belong on their terms than to be fully yourself and potentially end up alone, as if a lack of connection is linked to danger in some way or a threat to your survival as an adult. And that's the sacrifice, that's the toss-up and the self-abandonment, which ultimately leads to a lack of self-trust. But I want to say this to you. If you do recognize what I'm saying here, it's not a flaw or a failure, by the way. What it is, think about it, it's a brilliant survival strategy that worked for you in childhood, but it just isn't serving you now. So here's where it gets a bit more complex, especially if you're a queer woman who grew up with emotional neglect, trauma, criticism, heavy discipline, excessive standards, or disapproval. Even before you know that you're a lesbian or you're queer, before there's any of that conscious awareness of sexuality, your body has already learned something from that relational wounding that I've just talked about. Neglect, rejection, inconsistency, or emotional coldness. Stay small, stay hidden, and stay safe. Then later, as you begin to realize that you're gay, whether it's at 12 or 55, whatever age you are, you're not discovering your truth from a clean slate. You're discovering it through the lens of a nervous system that already believes that you're not safe to be fully seen. And because you've already internalized the idea that you are a problem, like I talked about a moment ago, your body adds this new awareness, I'm a lesbian or queer, to the existing belief that something is wrong with you. And so it doesn't get filed under what it should do is the beauty of self-discovery. It gets filed under risk. And what I call this a lot with my clients at Braver Women is double internalization. First, you internalize the trauma of not being emotionally met as a child to mean there's something wrong with you at an identity level. And then you internalize the message that being queer makes you even more subject to scrutiny or possible rejection. And that becomes risky and unsafe because your body doesn't separate those messages, it just stacks them. So later in life, when something feels similar, the nervous system reacts not with a memory that you can recall, but with feelings, a felt sense of shame, fear, But it's never recognized as shame, more so, like I say, anxiety, fear, not good enough. And these are the main descriptions, or even worthlessness. And that's the body reactivating the shame-stamped implicit memory because of internalization. This is why people don't walk into therapy saying, I feel shame. They say, I don't know what's wrong with me, or I just feel anxious, or I don't like myself, or I don't feel enough, or I'm scared of being on my own. Because when shame lives in implicit memory, you feel it without fully knowing what it is. So I want to talk to you now about how internalization happens. This internalization that I'm talking about, how you come to internalize inaccurate ideas about yourself and its links to anxiety. So anxiety, it's often the conscious expression of deeper unresolved emotions like fear or shame that your body is holding on to subconsciously. Rarely do we stop and consciously think, like I've said, hey, nobody says, hey, I'm feeling internalized shame today. Instead, we notice it shows up disguised as anxiety. It shows up disguised as nervousness, hypervigilance, or feeling inadequate or somehow flawed when it comes to your relational connections, ones that matter to you, and also establishing your place in the world. So here's how it happens scientifically. I'm going to try and keep this as simple as I can for you. When emotional encoding occurs, your brain stores intense emotional experiences, particularly negative ones, as subconscious patterns. What I mean when I say this is automatic ways of thinking, automatic ways of feeling or behaving that runs in the background that you don't question. These emotional memories are held mainly in the amygdala, the center in the brain that detects and activates the nervous system stress response. And over time, these emotional encodes become linked with specific triggers or situations, creating unconscious associations. Now, if you've spent years hearing messages, inaccurate messages, for example, like queerness is wrong, you might unconsciously associate being visible with shame or danger, even if you consciously know that it's not true. And for queer women, internalized shame or homophobia becomes encoded into the nervous system through repeated experiences like subtle disapproval, rejection, or social judgment. And while consciously we might believe that we've moved past those experiences, our nervous system remembers. The nervous system doesn't just differentiate clearly between past threats and current ones. It simply recognizes those familiar cues, real or imagined, and activates those protective responses in the form of uncomfortable feelings accordingly. Anxiety then is how your mind and body communicate unresolved emotional experiences from the past. It's your nervous system alerting you, saying, hey, something about this feels unsafe or unfamiliar. And this can show up, I wonder if you can recognize this. This can show up in racing thoughts, unease, physical tension, or even seemingly small moments of self-editing and hesitation. The anxiety that you experience is not random. It's a direct reflection of old emotional encodes reactivated in the present moment. These associations that I'm talking about, they live deep in the nervous system, and they're not about what you believe, but what they are about is what your body remembers. But here's what I want you to really, really know. That your anxiety, it's not random. It's a signal, a clue that an old emotional encode is being reactivated. And I like to call it, to my clients, an emotional echo. When you understand that, you can stop blaming yourself. You can shift from what's wrong with me to what outdated idea or old conditioned narrative is this response protecting me from. Anxiety then, it becomes not something to fix, but something to listen to. because it's never about the moment. It's about the meaning that you and your body still holds and associates to that feeling. It's not the anxiety that needs to be resolved. It's the ideas you have about yourself connected to the emotion that are causing you to feel anxious. Let me share a bit about my own story, because what I'm talking about here isn't theory. For me, it's lived and it's personal. And if you've been following my podcast for a while now, you know the reason why I share stories is to help you feel less alone and directly impact and normalize some of the experiences that you have so you feel less shame. Now, I grew up, as you know, in a strict religious home where there were very clear expectations on how to be a lady. I had a twin sister who was the definition of a real girly girl. She loved dresses, dolls, makeup, the whole package. And here's me. I was the complete opposite. All I wanted to do was to play with so-called boys' toys. I wasn't interested in anything other than like football, cricket, and cars. And so before I even had the words for it, I realized I was different. And it was noticed and highlighted all the time within my family. I was labeled as different and called a tomboy. And I remember having to ask my dad the first time I heard the term tomboy. I didn't know what it meant. And he said to me, it's a girl who acts and behaves like a boy. And I remember that jarring feeling that followed, like there was something wrong with me. Because we were twins, my difference was always magnified in this way. It wasn't neutral. It was zoomed in on throughout my childhood until I eventually internalized those ideas fully, looking back now, that on every level within my felt sense of self, I was wrong and flawed. And I'd constantly get comments inside and outside of the home growing up like, why don't you wear a dress? Why don't you wear a dress and dress like your sister? Why don't you wear your hair down so everyone can see it? Or you'd be so pretty if you just wore a bit of makeup and made a bit of effort. And at home, I was constantly criticized, singled out, and disciplined in a heavy-handed way, more so than my siblings. And so the emotional message that I took on every time that I felt that sting of being singled out, I was losing the connection with my parents and family by being rejected in those moments. And what I didn't know was each time this happened, it was reinforcing an inaccurate narrative that I was taking on, which was marked against those felt sensations that as a child, I didn't have the context to understand. And it wasn't always reinforced in loud, obvious ways, but in the silences, the eye rolls, or the disapproving tone, or even the look. We all know what that looks like, don't we? We've all experienced the look. And looking back, I realized that the criticism, the discipline, and the emotional abuse that I grew up with was my parents using their own unaddressed shame as a tool to shape and modify my behavior. Out of awareness, I'd learned to take on my parents' shame. I was never fully acknowledged or listened to. What I was conditioned to do was to modify and maneuver most of my young life around what was expected from my parents was their wants and needs. And I remember hearing all the time growing up, all the neighbours are looking at you in a dress, kicking a football up and down the street with the boys. Remember, you're a girl, behave like one. Or even, you're never going to amount to anything with grades like that. This constant drip feed of shame-based messages that wasn't even mine to carry. And it wasn't just rooted in sexual or gender expression. It was rooted in their shame and their fear of what others may say. Their fear and uncertainty of potentially having kids that might fail at school, might not be approved of by others, might grow up and not fit into the right class or have good financial status, might not grow up to be gender conforming like other kids. And what I realize now is that their seemingly best efforts of trying their hardest to have well turned out kids was being filtered through the lens of their fears and their shame without them even knowing it, or me. And I spoke earlier about the fragmented sense of self as the deepest cut of internalized shame. And this was certainly true for me. reflecting on my upbringing, looking back out of awareness, I developed this like secret sense of self, masks for the outside world and masks for my family. But when no one was watching, they were the times that I could fully relax and be myself and pursue my interests, because outside of the conforming and performing, the messages that my nervous system received was, you don't matter, your interests are wrong, you and your ideas are flawed, and you need to keep in line with the family expectations and the societal system that you're part of to stay a part of the pack and not be ostracized. And I really developed a flawed sense of self, which manifested it as low self-esteem, zero trust in myself. And I learned that it was only acceptable or safe to be me in isolation or behind closed doors. And that's the thing. Once internalized, we no longer have the feeling of shame. We are shame. And this was certainly the case for me, because when we experience ourselves as flawed and defective, we can't really look at ourselves without pain, can we? Because that pain, albeit incorrect pain, it can feel like proof, even though it doesn't equal the truth. So we create masks and, in essence, a palatable false self, also known as a persona, or in my case, the adapted child who later grew up with this learning that I'd experienced in childhood to be the adapted adult, to fall in line with everybody else. And I became the black sheep as a child because I could never fall in line, and it always came at a cost. I was constantly emotionally ostracized and made to feel like an outsider. And I experienced this constant push-pull dynamic that was conditional and performance-based. If I met the requirements, I was seen it and acknowledged. But if I stepped over that thin line of my parents' shame-based expectations, then I was back in the emotional wilderness once again. So over time, my adaptation was I learned to play small or to hide the fact that my family seemingly rejected me. I'd always blush, go red. Eye contact with anyone was really painful. I'd always be looking down. My body language would be arms folded, legs crossed. I'd speak quietly. I couldn't take up space. Couldn't let my words linger. I felt a need to constantly be talking. Couldn't be comfortable with silence. I wasn't able to talk out loud very well for fear of all eyes being on me, which is ironic now considering what I do. So what I did and what I recognize now, and what you might be able to recognize, is this overcompensation. I learned to be useful. So I became the joker, the fixer, the helper. And the version of myself that I thought would earn me love, approval, and connection, because being myself, it didn't seem like an option. And I see this so much with my clients. They learn to become who they are trained to think the world wants and needs. And later in my life, when I couldn't deny who I was anymore, I cut my hair short and I came out around 17 or 18. And that simple act of coming out and a haircut became a social threat, not just to my family, but my friends and society in general. I'd walk into shops and feel people stare. I'd hold my partner's hand and watch heads turn. I've been misgendered, denied access to female restrooms, asked personal and invasive questions about my sexuality and gender expression, told to be quiet or that I'm not normal for being gay by people who supposedly love me, and the outside world giving me those messages as well. And these experiences, I know, hold so much weight for many of you listening too. How can you be gay if you've never been with a man? That's a familiar one, isn't it? Can you not just tone it down a bit and at least put a bit of makeup on or grow your hair? Why can't you act or dress more like a woman? You're not a man. Why do you dress like one? These are all the things that we've been brought up with and we've heard. And for me, it didn't just happen at home. It was in the sports changing rooms when I played sport, where I felt hyper visible and out of place. In shops where I'd be browsing for a hoodie or a crew neck t-shirt in the men's section of department stores. And I'd feel that quiet judgment from strangers or the server behind the till. In workplaces where I'd be the only visibly queer woman in the room, dressed in a suit. And I suddenly, this overcompensation came in where I felt I had to be extra professional or work extra hard just to belong. And these are just some of the micro traumas that become stacked. That stacked and internalized experience. And I'm sharing it because I know fine well that you're listening to this now, and you too have had so much of this to contend with as well. We all experience shame, but in different ways. But the one universal thing for queer women and anyone, I think, in minority groups, what it becomes is this constant drip feed, the drip feed of difference, the daily reminders of you're not quite right, you don't quite fit, which leads to those not good enough, feeling like a failure, feeling inadequate ideas, which are internalized as a truth because of the overwhelming life experiences and micro exposures that you've been subjected to by repetition. And I think even in 2025, we still haven't moved on as much as we like to think, have we? Because here's the truth. First, we're devalued by others, and then we learn to devalue and oppress ourselves. And what it leads to is a total lack of self-acceptance and living with a need to outprove the messages or perform, policing your emotions, judging your body negatively, or apologizing for taking up space, that constant self-monitoring where you ask yourself, am I too much? Do I make people feel uncomfortable? Or if I wasn't different, then I'd feel like I belong more. And it's that sense of being different that's deeply felt, which causes the problematic survival behaviors. And that's what happened to me. I wore so many masks that eventually I didn't know which version of me was real. I felt emotionally alone, disconnected and inauthentic, not because I didn't want to be myself, but because I'd been taught that being myself wasn't right, it wasn't approved of, and ultimately was unsafe. And I didn't know how to be me, how to be myself and be comfortable with it, because I'd never been taught to relax into just being me. And so the more I played into those expectations, the more distant I became from my own values, my own needs and my own truth. And that's what shame does. It disconnects you from you. It creates a split, who you are and who you're pretending to be, just to feel like you belong, until it eventually becomes so ingrained that you end up confusing your survival mask for who you really are. And it eventually feels and sounds like, I don't know who I am. I don't feel like I know what I want. I don't feel like I know what makes me tick. And when you're so disconnected to who you really are, you have to find your way back through the jungle of overwhelming feelings paired with conditioned narratives and reinforced ideas that you've been believing all these years. And I wonder now if you can start to see how shame has roots in anxiety and overthinking and your self-talk. Because if shame creates a core belief that something is wrong with me, if that's the belief, then anxiety is the nervous system's response to protect you from that perceived threat of being exposed. Self-talk and overthinking are your brain's attempt to manage, control, or avoid that exposure by rehearsing, by doubting, or correcting yourself before others can. And it makes sense, doesn't it? When all the messages you receive in the world are, you don't fit in, you can't help but reach a bottom line conclusion when the evidence is so overwhelming that somehow you are wrong. So what changed for me? Well, I started to realize that I wasn't broken. I started to realize that being gay isn't wrong. It's not being queer that was ever the issue. It's the shame that you felt that was and is wrong. It's the shame paired with the narratives that you should never have had to carry on other people's behalves, all of which has led you to inaccurately concluding that being yourself was wrong. So what I'm going to do now is talk to you about how to properly recognize shame and also why it often gets confused with guilt. And I also want to talk to you about the defensive survival responses to shame, which can show up in various areas of your life, which keep the cycle of self-loathing and that enoughness going. So I think a simple way to think about it is shame is a self-definition. I am not enough, where guilt is a feeling of I did something wrong. One is about what you did, and the other is about who you think you are as a result of what you did. This is what I mean when I talk about shame being silent and insidious, making it really hard to move past the lens of being a flawed and broken human being. If you think you're broken and flawed, it can lead to helplessness and self-sabotage, and it can sabotage any opportunity for change therapeutically, because it can become scary, can't it? It can become scary and hard to imagine yourself as someone who is not how you've experienced yourself for so many years. One is about the moment that's passed, and the other is about your felt sense of identity. And this is why I use a trauma-informed approach. I work with my clients to dig down deeper, way deeper past those decoy, nuanced emotions of being ashamed, of guilt or embarrassment, which can mimic the real issue that's going on. And I help my clients to acknowledge and look for the root level self-definition. So if you think about it, feeling ashamed is not the same as shame, but it often gets confused. Feeling ashamed is a feeling. It's not a self-definition in the same way that shame is. Feeling embarrassed is a temporary reaction to, say, a faux pas, whereas shame has a deeper feeling of inadequacy and worthlessness. And when we feel inadequate, it makes sense, doesn't it, to try and hide that. And this is what brings so many clients into therapy, because shame manifests into defensive responses that bypass shame itself. And examples that I work with commonly are anger, being defensive and constantly blaming or over-explaining, people-pleasing, anxiety, withdrawal and pulling away, shutting down and isolating yourself, that disassociation, distracting or numbing out, and that perfectionism that we talk about. Now, perfectionism is the common way to defend against shame. It's the anxiety of always chasing, of always proving, trying to do better and be better, the constant chasing of being worthy. And in many respects, what I uncover with my clients is the fear of shame becomes an ongoing anxiety driving the need to be perfect. And what it means is shame is bypassed, and only the anxiety and the chasing feeling is the thing that registers. So these survival responses become automatic. And like I've said throughout this podcast episode, if that's what's been emotionally encoded into your nervous system, then that's the framework. That's the lens. That's the blueprint that you'll keep running until you interrupt it. So let's talk about how to interrupt the conditioned feeling, that conditioned memory, that emotional memory of shame. One thing I ask my clients is, when you think about being truly seen, notice your body. How does your body react? And I ask this because you can't just think your way out of toxic shame. It's not something that you can mindset your way out of. Because as you know, shame doesn't live in your logic. It lives in your emotional body. And it's held as a felt emotional memory paired with that self-deprecating narrative. And for a lot of women, they tell me that they feel it as a lump or a constriction in the throat, in the gut. They'll feel it in the gut as a sick feeling, as a nausea, or a pressure in the chest as racing anxiety, or a tightness that they notice. Could be feeling frozen or numb. These are all classic bodily survival responses to feeling unwanted, feeling judged, and fearing isolation. And I think the first thing to understand is what keeps shame going, what continues to feed it. And the first thing, number one, is silence, just saying nothing, not acknowledging it. The second thing is secrecy and keeping it hidden. And the third thing is self-judgment, that self-defamation of your own character. When we work hard to squash down what we feel, we have this illusion that we're in control, right? But the reality is, just because you don't consciously connect to that discomfort, it doesn't magic it away. It will sit there playing out how I've described until you see it, until you acknowledge it, until you give it words and understand what your conditioned nervous system is trying to protect you from, that it no longer needs to as an adult. And that's why I share stories on this podcast and in the Braver Women community, because shame can't survive. It can't survive exposure to truth, connection, compassion, or shared humanity. When you hear someone say, hey, listen, I felt like the odd one out too, or hey, you know what, I've questioned myself as well. I went through that and I didn't feel enough either. Something in you softens. You stop looking down at the floor and caving in on yourself, and you lift your head up a little bit higher and breathe a bit easier. And it makes you feel a lot more connected and less alone in your experience. When you make the decision to move empathetically into, I wonder why this feeling is here, rather than, I wonder why I'm wrong, in that moment, you're no longer viced in its grip, being dragged along as a passenger to those feelings, and it doesn't have the same level of control over you in the way that it normally would. And what I do here at Braver Women, by sharing stories on this podcast, is to try to move you into compassionately normalizing your experiences rather than leaving you feeling flawed and isolated. Nearly every woman who's worked with me has gone on to tell their story in one way or another, whether it's recording a podcast with me or sharing in the Facebook group. Because when we share stories in the queer community, we change the meaning of the narrative. Shame is a social emotion, and being part of a community with shared experiences, it helps you to understand that it's not you who is the problem. It's the sensations that come with the narrative that you've been believing all these years to be true. And I also think, rather than you thinking about shame as being pathological, I want you to be curious about how it's been self-protective, and move out from that direction. Make that your starting place. And before I finish, I just want to touch on something that's really common with my clients. And you might notice yourself doing it too. And I think this can really help you as well. And that's confusing guilt with shame. I often hear this in my practice. I feel guilty for not being able to. And when I hear this, what it really points to is I feel shame. Because what it really means is what I don't perceive myself to be able to do means that I'm a bad person. And what I see this as is inverted shame through the disguising lens of guilt, if you like. Think about it. Saying to yourself or out loud, I have a feeling that tells me I'm fundamentally flawed because I don't believe I can do X, Y, and Z. That's painful, isn't it? And so language has such a profound effect for how we feel. And when we talk about something in an inaccurate or evasive way, we circumnavigate pain, we avoid it. But the only way past shame is to go through it. When you say, I feel guilty for not being able to, it often masks the shame, because guilt is about doing something wrong or making a mistake, nearly always in the past. But shame, as you know now, is about being wrong. It's about inaccurately telling yourself that you are wrong. When someone says, I feel guilty that I'm not coping, or I feel guilty for not doing more, what they're often unconsciously saying is, my inability to do or be something makes me bad, broken, or not enough. And that's inverted shame, expressed through the more socially acceptable lens of guilt. Why? Because guilt is easier to say. It keeps things external. it keeps things external and manageable. Whereas shame, on the other hand, it touches identity and self-worth. And when we can't bear to touch that pain directly, we soften it with words, or a word that feels safer. So I think for you, have a think about how you frame things to yourself, because language is also a strategy. The nervous system often uses language to circumnavigate pain. When we downplay, mislabel, or rationalize emotions, not because we're lying to ourselves, but because it's protective, right? It's important to give what you're experiencing accurate words, to bathe it in sunlight, to recognize that it's a somatic bodily sensation that you're experiencing. It's not who you are. It's what you've been trained to feel. And so in that sense, when you can be the observer of the inaccurate narratives that you've been carrying, the observer of your feelings, and you gently begin to be curious at the emotional weight that you're holding on to through a lens of self-compassion and empathy, it means that you get to be in charge of your body. When everything is screaming at you on the inside to cave in and run or freeze, notice what happens when you begin to anchor yourself with your breath, and give yourself the one thing that's going to feel very vulnerable to start with. It's about holding the line on the inside with yourself and giving yourself some space, teaching your body to pause. Because the goal isn't to become fearless, it's to reteach your body to be fully you, even when it feels risky. Now, if something in today's episode has hit home for you, maybe a feeling that you couldn't quite name before, that's not by accident. That's likely shame starting to surface. And as uncomfortable as that might feel, it's also the start of something real for you. Because shame isn't who you are, it's something that you've learned. And the good news is that what's been learned can gently begin to be unlearned. You don't have to keep proving, pleasing, or performing just to feel safe. You can take the mask off, bit by bit, breath by breath. And if you want support while you do that, come and join us. Come and connect with me in the Braver Women Facebook group. I'll put the link in the show notes, because it's where we talk about the real stuff, the stuff that doesn't get spoken about enough, with women who just get it. And you don't have to do this alone. And in that space, you won't be. So for now, I hope this has really helped you. I hope this has resonated, and I can't wait to hear from you soon. Take care, and I'll chat to you on the next episode. Bye for now.